some days are harder than others. So I think if you are in that very difficult time where maybe you feel like you're at your lowest of lows, then what helped me get through that was knowing like every day is a new day. Every day starts over and I have another chance to work through this. Um, and also just remembering this is one thing my therapist told me that I always like it just never will be out of my head, which is that everything is temporary. So if I can get through the rest of this day where I'm feeling, just I mean, suicidal thoughts come into play too when you're in that very, very deep phase, and I think that's where it's very critical to think about this is a thought that I have right now. I may not have this thought in a couple hours. I may not have this thought tomorrow. So thinking about everything is temporary is that, and it goes both ways, right? Like the negative or down parts are temporary. So it means you can kind of pull together the strength to get through those. And then the happy moments are temporary too, because happiness is fleeting. So to really enjoy the moment when you're in it, that's what really helps me is just grounding myself and taking it day by day.
Welcome to the EQ Gangster podcast, where you will learn practical tools to grow your mental and emotional health and intelligence to be the best version of yourself, both at work and at home. It is real, raw, and transformational. The journey of emotional growth isn't easy, but it's worth it. I believe in you. Super Jessica. So excited to have you. So EQ Gangsters that are listening or watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast, this is going to be an amazing, amazing episode. I follow her on LinkedIn. So Jessica Luna, if you are not following her on LinkedIn, go follow, subscribe, stalk immediately because she has so much amazing, not just leadership skinny, but emotional, intelligent leadership skinny, and some super insightful. I love all things EQ, and she just has some tremendously insightful resources and comments and insights. And what's also super cool about Jessica is she has some phenomenal tools and infographics that really provide a great visual to the whole EQ world and EQ leadership space. So Jessica, I'm super excited to talk to you today. Thank you for making time. And I'm excited to learn more about you. Can you just share, how did you get started on this journey?
Yeah, thanks for having me, by the way. This is great. And thanks for that wonderful intro. So how I got started on the EQ journey. Um, I would say that it started out before I even knew I was on it, as most of us, right? So we don't understand that, why we have a way with people or we can read a room, like things like that are kind of those early indicators that we don't realize are actually connected to emotional intelligence. And so for me, it was really my personal journey that inspired where I am because I I was always this very like type A ambitious person. Like I gotta go, go, go. And maybe that kind of societal masculine energy, right? Like you just keep going and finishing work and not really thinking about the emotional piece of what's going on in your life. And so that's how I really got to where I was. I just kind of ignored, difficult situations in my life um, and I would say ignore the emotional part of it. So I was like, okay, this is something that's happening in my life. I'm not going to let it affect me. I'm going to keep going. And so I did. And, there's benefits to that because it allowed me to rise through the ranks in corporate and become an executive. So I went from analyst to executive in 6 years. And that's awesome. I don't regret having that success, but I look back on that now after having got depressed and burned out and realized what I was doing to myself along the way by ignoring my feelings associated with things that were happening to me. And so all of those things kind of piled up and led me to become burned out and depressed. And I had this, I kind of call it a factory reset. So it was like a factory reset of me in my life. Like, so if I get to the top of this corporate ladder that I was trying so hard to get to the top of, is it what I want? Like, was I climbing it for me? Was I climbing it for, society or other pressures, like, people in my life or whatever? And so I really had to think about that. And when I reflected and, worked through my depression and healed myself, I came to realize that I spent a lot of my life just going, going, going and not actually enjoying it. So I didn't enjoy the things that I was doing. I didn't enjoy even like the benefits of all the hard work I put in. I didn't really enjoy it. Um, and then the other thing is, after all of that, I'm like, why am I so successful? Because I get asked that question all the time. Well, how did you climb the ladder so quickly? And, why are you so good with people? And, those kind of things. And so that really caused me to take another step back and reflect on my success and deconstruct it. And so you'll see that's probably why you like the infographic so much and why a lot of people respond to them, because that's one of my gifts that I have is deconstructing things and breaking them down into simple, easy to grasp kind of buckets. And so that's what I did with my success. And when I did that, I kept coming back to the reason I'm so successful is my high emotional intelligence. And so when I came back to that, I'm like, we don't really talk about emotional intelligence. We say like a people person or, she's charming or he's good at, bringing people around and influencing them, but we don't understand where that is coming from. Like, what is the source of that success? And so, again, in my research and also coaching my teams in my role, coaching my kind of friends and family before I had my business too, it always came back to emotional intelligence. And when we worked on concepts related to emotional intelligence, that's where they saw the success and the improvement in themselves and their careers, in their relationships. It's not just business, it's obviously permeates throughout your entire life. So that was a really long-winded thing, but it all kind of, comes together of why EQ is so important to me.
So, Jessica, your were your parents like emotionally intelligent? Did you get any exposure to this in childhood at all, or like were you curious or people aware or self-aware in childhood, or was it truly not until you burn out and kind of went through your depression?
Yeah, so my story is very interesting, and I actually had one of my most popular posts was about this, where I posted a wheel of emotions, and I talk about how, upon some of that reflection I was talking about before, I realized that I have a high emotional intelligence without acknowledging my feelings. And I'm like, how is that possible? So that really, it just like shocked me, and I had to kind of unwrap it. And if you look at the quadrants of emotional intelligence, I think about it like four pieces. So there's self-awareness, there's social awareness, there's self-management, and then relationship management. If you look at those pieces, um, there's pieces then within that, right? So you could score maybe high on three of the four or even four out of the four, but you're missing a piece because self-awareness is not just your emotions, it's your thoughts, it's your identities, it's your mindset, your attitude. So, to answer your question, I was not exposed to it when I was a child. It was actually the opposite of that because I grew up in foster care and my biological parents were not in the picture. So, for me, I learned from an early age to be very independent and very observant. And so, when I think about, digesting why did I have a high emotional intelligence in such a tough environment? It was out of necessity. It was being conscientious. Also, probably connected to my personality too, because I'm more introverted. I'm very analytical. I like to kind of sit back and watch and observe, and to your point, very curious. And so I think all of those things helped me grow emotional intelligence without really realizing it.
Wow. Wow. That is no joke. And that makes sense. Growing up in foster care, I can only imagine, as part of survival,
Mhm.
you've got to have your radars have got to be, I would imagine, pretty dialed in. Wow, that's no joke. What have been some of the most challenging things that or what is one maybe of the most challenging things that you've had to overcome emotionally?
That's a good question. Um, I would say that, all of us, and I'm not the only one, all of us have childhood trauma in some fashion. And I think a lot of us want to say it's not trauma. It wasn't that bad, and we want to downplay it. But if you look at the definition of trauma and you start researching like PTSD and things like that, you realize that it doesn't have to be this acute traumatic event in your mind, like a car wreck, as an example. That's a very acute thing where it's very visceral in your mind. And it could just be like your dad never told you that he was proud of you. And that over time eats up at you. And that over time kind of wiggles into your brain and your subconscious and affects things that you don't realize. So I think for me initially, because I have that strong exterior and I was, on this mission to be successful in the beginning in healing myself, the probably the biggest challenge was to admit to myself that digging into my emotions doesn't make me weak.
Well, and I would argue, having gone through, my journey much later than you did, in terms of like my healing journey and growth journey, specifically in the area of EQ emotions.
Mhm.
I would argue it's the opposite. That it takes a tremendous
I
amount of
agree.
guts and strength and courage and I think that's
Yes,
one of the reasons why so many people don't do it, is because it's no joke.
absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
I was gonna say it. Of course, I have a post about this too, but I talk about, the hard skills and soft skills thing. Like the things we call soft skills, like emotional intelligence and people, working with people, that's actually the hard stuff. To your point, it is so difficult. And it is because we have to set our pride aside and we have to be vulnerable and we have to be willing to, look quote unquote touchy feely or whatever these like terms that society, business, whatever has told us are not acceptable in business, which doesn't make sense because we can't separate those things in our brains like physically. So it doesn't make sense. But yeah, I mean, that is the hardest work you'll ever do, but it is the most rewarding work you will ever do as well.
What does that mean, Jessica, to work on your emotions? So, like your journey. Let's even get more specific. Like
Yeah.
when you say, okay, I worked on my healing and I worked on my emotions, like what does that even mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think it can mean lots of different things for lots of different people because obviously we all have different needs and we all have things that like coping mechanisms that work for us that may not work for others. For me, as I said before, I'm a very curious person. I'm a very analytical person. You can probably tell by my infographics, I'm very, so like Virgo type A, whatever you want to call it. I like to be organized and I like to put things in neat boxes. So for me, because I had so much trauma and emotion stacked up from my childhood that I childhood and adolescence and even 20s that I didn't process. I actually, and this was while I was in therapy. So I finally, that was another thing. I was always like, I don't need therapy. I can do this without it. And I finally broke down and did it. And in therapy, one of the things that I'll say too for everyone listening is that we think that therapy is going to fix things for us. And it's not. Like you still do the work. The therapist is there to support you through it and ask you questions and, you know, put you on the path that you need to be on, but you still have to put in the hard work. So for me, the work was what I call a trauma map is what I made. And I listed every single kind of major trauma that I had in my life. So for me, one of those was physical abuse. Okay. Just so that we can be clear, because, what is trauma? I mean, that's a sliding scale too. So I listed all the traumas that I had, and then I did research and I was like, okay, what symptoms would someone who experienced physical abuse, as an example, what symptoms would they have? And it could be like guilt, it could be low self-esteem, it could be blaming themselves for what happened to them. So those kind of things. I wrote down all of those things. And then after I had all of that written down, I kind of went through and highlighted like, where do I see recurring themes? So, of course, every single one of those traumas could cause anxiety. It could cause depression. It could cause fatigue. So I started to see those things highlighted, and I'm like, okay, it makes sense why I'm feeling depressed. And that was part of me cultivating self acceptance in myself to say it's okay to be fatigued. It's okay to be depressed because you've experienced all of these things. And actually seeing it on paper is really powerful. And then after that, I asked myself, like, do I still feel upset about this thing? And I went down the list and went through that and over time tried to process it. So for me in the early days, it was walking outside and just being in my thoughts. Listening to music is really helpful for me. So I would actually match music to my mood. If I was sad or I felt like I needed to cry, I would listen to sad music and it would help me get that emotion out. So again, there's different techniques and you learn what coping mechanisms work for you over time. And I've gotten into a lot more other things now, but that's kind of how I started out doing it.
How do you prevent? Okay, so love that. Love that. Thank you for sharing all that. And thank you for your
Sure.
vulnerability. And thank you for the work that you've done for us to be in a spot where you're influencing thousands of people through your healing and growth journey. So thank you. I really appreciate the blood, sweat, and tears that you've gone through to be who you are today, Jessica. I really,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate that. How do you when you're going through that healing journey, how do you prevent the never-ending descent into the toilet bowl of your despair and pain and hurt and
Mhm.
trauma? How do you prevent from just that constant descent?
Um, I would say it depends on where you're at in your journey. So if you're on this downward spiral and you're in this despair, everything's a sliding scale. Some days are harder than others. So I think if you are in that very difficult time where maybe you feel like you're at your lowest of lows, then what helped me get through that was knowing like every day is a new day. Every day starts over and I have another chance to work through this. Um, and also just remembering this is one thing my therapist told me that I always like it just never will be out of my head, which is that everything is temporary. So if I can get through the rest of this day where I'm feeling, just I mean, suicidal thoughts come into play too when you're in that very, very deep phase, and I think that's where it's very critical to think about this is a thought that I have right now. I may not have this thought in a couple hours. I may not have this thought tomorrow. So thinking about everything is temporary is that, and it goes both ways, right? Like the negative or down parts are temporary. So it means you can kind of pull together the strength to get through those. And then the happy moments are temporary too, because happiness is fleeting. So to really enjoy the moment when you're in it, that's what really helps me is just grounding myself and taking it day by day.
So one of the emotions that I felt when my therapist, when I first sat down with a therapist and he said, Noble, let me introduce you to two revolutionary new concepts. I'm like, dude, talk to me. He's like, feelings and emotions. I'm like, no idea what you're talking about. And so he said, that's why we're talking. You need a lot of
Yeah.
help. And so when he, because I legit had no concept or awareness of feelings or emotions 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when he first like revealed to me these two things called feelings and emotions, and the fact that I had as a 40-year-old dude had
Hmm.
no concept of this aspect of life that not only is affecting me to an extreme in a negative way at that time, but also to right. We all have emotions and feelings.
Yeah.
One of my first emotions after he revealed to me about feelings and emotions was rage, anger, and terror. It The concept of being a 40-year-old dude and being so clueless, I
Yeah.
felt exposed and
Hmm.
embarrassed and ashamed and terrified. Like it was almost like, the whole analogy of like you don't want to look under the bed or the open the your closet in the middle of the night because the monsters like I'm like I I know I have monsters under my emotional bed and I have
Yeah.
no idea how to fight them off or deal with them when I open the closet door and I'm seeing all these scary monsters. I, I don't I don't have the first clue on how to deal with them or handle them. How did
Hmm.
you go through that process?
Yeah. So that you're reminding me of uh that emotional wheel post that I mentioned before. And it actually like made me sad that it was so popular because when I like one of the things that I wrote in there was I was 34 before I knew how to name my emotions. And so exactly what you said, I felt embarrassed. I felt stupid because like, I have built up this persona for myself and this confidence in my intelligence. And all of a sudden it's like that is being threatened because emotions are a very basic part of our life. And so for us to not be able to name them, it's like, that's crazy. So you think about that. But then again, take a step back and from the self blame and ask, like, why do I not know this stuff? Well, it's because there's no formal education around it, or even doesn't have to be formal, but even just, something that your parents or your authority figures in your life, maybe teachers or whatever, you don't get that knowledge when you're growing up. And so I think it takes something like this to happen to you where either, you're not ready until you're ready. So that's one thing. But also, I was talking to my friend about this the other day, but it's like sometimes it takes like a major event in our life to happen before we actually will see it. Like it's that thing that wakes us up. So sometimes like, the depression or an event where maybe you were really mean to your loved one and that was like, oh wow, why was I so mean to my loved one? And it makes you kind of reflect. Like those situations are what help us see that. The part of addressing the monsters, that was really hard because my therapist was like, what brings you comfort? And I couldn't answer her question. So even basic stuff like that, where we just don't put thought towards these things because we're going about our day. We don't set aside time to think about, okay, what if I'm feeling upset, if I'm feeling angry, how do I deal with that anger? Like, what is the answer? So it's like having a response plan for that. Um, so what I did in the early days was actually create a note on my phone of things that made me feel comforted. And so when I was upset, I could go to that list and kind of run down it and say, okay, I can listen to music, I can journal, I can take a walk outside. Like those are the coping mechanisms for me that work for me. And those, this list is fluid, right? Like it changes over time as you grow as a person and you become more mature in your emotional intelligence and even mental health. Like there's that connection of mental health and emotional intelligence that we don't often talk about too. But I think having that is the very baseline starting point is how are you going to deal with emotions when they come up? And because I think about emotions and feelings as they are two different things. And at least in my mind, and there's a lot of people who have a lot of like very strong opinions about this. The way I think about it in my mind is emotions are like these reactionary things that happen. So they're kind of floating through our mind on the surface. You think about like, the surface of a lake, you have maybe leaves floating on it or something. Those are your emotions. So they're temporary, they're reactions to stimuli in your environment. Your feelings may be deeper, like deeper emotions related to events. So maybe like a sunken ship under the water or something. It's under the water and you can't see it, and it's connected to that shipwreck, which was a traumatic event. So that's kind of how I think about it in my mind. I don't know if that's scientifically accurate or, whatever, but I think having the coping mechanisms for the top is one thing. And then researching a plan of how are you going to pull out the feelings when you're ready that are associated with that shipwreck so you can actually work through them and let them go.
That's man, that's excellent. And I love the idea. So I think another interesting point is just that there are some healthy, productive coping mechanisms and some unhealthy,
Hmm.
unproductive coping mechanisms. One of
Yes.
mine that I developed was, and I didn't realize it again until I started to go through this process, is food addiction, sugar addiction, people pleasing addiction,
Hmm.
and were some of my coping mechanisms. And thankfully, since then, I've got some new coping mechanisms that are a lot healthier: lifting, walking, uh, of course, my Bible reading, cold plunging, all kinds of stuff,
Yeah.
which are a lot more healthy and productive. And I love that idea of like what makes me feel comforted. Man, that's a tough one. I've got to chew on that. That's really good. That's really
Hmm.
good. But I think the point is, I love your idea of having your emotional response plan. So and I tell people like, dude, it's not if you're going to get body slammed by emotions. Like that's part of the journey of life. You're going to get throat
Yeah.
punched occasionally by emotions that come out of nowhere. And I do jujitsu,
Hmm.
combat cuddling, struggle snuggles, aggressive yoga,
Yeah.
murder laundry, doing the
I
laundry
used
with
to watch UFC a while ago.
awesome. So
Yeah.
one of the things my analogy I use is like once you learn how to do jujitsu, it doesn't matter who the opponent is. Whether
Hmm.
I'm going to roll with you or I'm going to roll with a 6'5", 350 pound Division I gorilla wrestler,
Yeah.
you know, the, and anything in between, right? It, like as long as you know some of the basics of jujitsu, I'll know how to roll with you safely. I'll know how to roll with a big giant gorilla safely. I can roll with
Hmm.
everybody safely and not freak out. Now that doesn't mean that you're not going to beat me or that the big gorilla's not going to beat me, but our role is going to be safe, right? And I'm going to get a lot out of rolling with you. I'm going to get a lot of rolling out of with the gorilla, but it's going to be safe. That's what I tell people
Yeah.
with emotions. When you learn how to roll with your emotions, it doesn't matter if it's anger or depression or sadness or suicidal thoughts or joy or happiness or
Mhm.
fulfillment or discouragement. If you have some basic jujitsu moves on how to roll, you can roll with every emotion and it doesn't have to be this big, scary experience. Like, oh, hey, anger, what's up? Yeah, I've rolled with you before. Like, hey, what can I learn from you? What are we going to talk about today? What are we going to learn about in this?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I love that. You triggered my brain on another thing my therapist told me. She's very present in my brain today, I guess. Um, because she told me one of the things that really stuck with me early and when I was first learning about this too, like emotions coming in, is she said treat emotions as visitors in your home. So invite them in, give them tea, whatever, have a conversation with them, understand what message they are bringing you, and then send them on their way. And that's something that that's that connection that I was missing when I talked about before, what was I happy during this like ascent up this, corporate ladder? And that's the thing that people don't understand is they're they're so scared of the emotions that they just push them away and ignore them, but the emotions are actually what makes you feel fulfilled, what makes you feel like you're living. You have this deep connection with the world and with people around you, and you don't feel that as deeply unless you're in tune with your emotions. So now that I've gone through where I had emotional numbness and never I was worried that I wasn't going to get that back. So having that back is a privilege. Every time I cry, it makes me feel happy because I'm like, I'm healthy. I'm crying, which is what I'm supposed to do, which is, it took me a long journey to get there. So I think embracing the emotions we have as, they're teaching us something, they're allowing us to be more in tune with our own self, our soul, our brain, how we're feeling in the moment and grounding us in this world too, in connection with people. So it's not that, to your point, it's like we're rolling with them. It's this challenge, but it's not a negative thing. It's something that we have a privilege to do in our life.
Yes, love that. And that they're not our identity. Because I used to
Yes.
say, I am angry. I am. And my wife was like, Noble, that's not quite accurate. I'm like, no, no, you don't understand. Because when I get angry, like I feel like it is my identity.
Yeah, I
And,
get that. Yeah.
and she's like, dude, there's a lot of people, including me, that her that that
Hmm.
can feel angry and behave differently. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I am not one of those. Right? I didn't have, I had I was literally a 40-year-old emotional 5-year-old. I did not have the
Yeah.
ability. And thankfully, over, 6, 7 years now of being on this journey, now I can say I feel angry, not
Hmm.
I am angry, right? Which are two very, very different statements.
Yeah.
And that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling, work through it, process it, roll with that emotion. And then once you roll with that emotion, it will dissipate and learn the lessons
Yeah.
that you're supposed to learn. Okay. So now I want to kind of switch the direction a little bit based on your experience in corporate America and with your super awareness on emotional intelligence. What are those areas in corporate America that you feel leaders are lacking in the area of emotional intelligence?
Well, that's a loaded question. Where do I start? I think that number one, there's still a really big stigma around it, around having emotions in the workplace. And I think part of that is like if you have read anything about, masculine and feminine energy and how we all have masculine and feminine energy inside of us. And we are in our kind of ambitious achieving mode, which is what we're all in at work. We're all thought driven. And this is based on a book I read that was great by Dr. Pat Allen. Um, she's amazing. So you should look up her book if you're interested in this concept. But she talks about how we are all in our masculine energy at work. So that means we're thought driven. And so naturally we want to push away our emotions, but our emotions still are there. And so one of the things you said in your last comment about having your emotions not be you, like saying I feel angry versus I am angry and not being able to separate those things in the moment. That's one thing that I think people have a hard time with because it's like, okay, you're telling me to feel angry at work and it's okay, but then I can't show anger in a meeting because that's not being a good leader. So there's this, like, I guess people thinking about it very black and white. And that's where it comes back to emotional intelligence with the self control piece, the self management. Self control is within self management. So it's not saying that we're ignoring the anger, but it's saying there's a time and a place to process the anger. And it is not in front of your team, in front of an audience. Like, obviously, that's not a good look. And, it's also just not kind to people. It's like the social awareness piece, like, you don't want to bring everyone down because you're feeling angry. So saying, okay, I recognize I am feeling angry. I'm going to table that and I need to process this later when I have some time for myself. So I think having these ways to like frame this when it happens is something that is lacking in corporate America because we say, well, he's a bad leader because he got angry at everybody and showed it. And it's like, well, he may just lack some self-control. So if we worked with him, gave him coaching, gave him, some leadership development that was actually focused on emotional intelligence, we'd probably see a different leader. And so I think the problem is we want these really great emotionally intelligent leaders, but we don't give them the resources to be those leaders. And that's what's incredibly frustrating to me and why I have built my company because it is hard where we're in this we feel like we're walking on eggshells because emotional intelligence is tied to mental health. And so it's like how do we tell someone that they need to get help? Because that's like crossing a line. But how do we kind of keep it professional? So I think we're kind of always grappling with that, and it's difficult because no situation is the same. We can't just draw a line and say this is how the answer to this situation always. We have to use critical thinking, and we have to have resources in place to do that.
That's great. That's great. What, and this is, I know would be kind of probably totally anecdotal based on your experience, I'm interested to hear based on all the leaders that you work with in corporate America, what percentage of leaders do you feel are truly teachable?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess okay, to frame it the way you presented it. So if I think about the leaders that I have worked with, um, I think leaders who are not willing to invest time in their personal development are not going to be working with someone like me or you. That's just kind of how it works, right? So it goes back to this very simple concept, which is skill and will. And it's one of the only things I ever remember from leadership training that I had in corporate is skill versus will. And I think about this with delegation, but also when I'm thinking about, working with leaders is do they have the skill to do something? If they don't, I can teach them, but only if they have the will, which means the positive attitude. Are they willing to learn? Are they willing to put their pride aside and say, I'm not the expert at this, but I want to learn. Like I want to improve. So I think that's obviously the most important piece of it. So I would say to answer your question, the majority of the leaders I work with are that way. And, if they don't have the will, then we don't end up working together because I'm not going to waste my time and they don't want to waste their time with me. If they're not willing to put in the work, then it's not going to work out because, you and I, people like us who coach and provide development, we can only do so much. It has to be them. It's like just like leadership development or people development. We can't develop our team. We can give them the resources to do it, but they have to take that and run with it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I've struggled a lot with because sometimes with us, we work with a lot of companies that the leader, the CEO or somebody, the HR director will hire us and bring us in
Hmm.
to work with their top whatever 20
Yeah.
leaders, 30 leaders, 100 leaders, whatever. Well, there's a percentage of those leaders that are doing it because the CEO said so, not because they genuinely want to grow and change.
Yeah.
And and I've struggled with, well, no, I can help anybody learn and grow and change. And I've just come to the conclusion that I can't. if they're not if they don't take ownership of their own journey, I could be, Tony Robbins or John Maxwell, and it's just not
Yeah.
gonna happen.
Yeah. I think I would reframe that and say, I can teach anyone, but are they willing to accept what I'm putting out? It's
Mm,
not about you, it's about them. Are they ready for
right.
it?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I love that. That's great perspective.
I get what you mean though, because it's like you want to help everybody, but some people just aren't ready for it. And some people are stuck in their ways of, oh, well, I'm going to do this, like to your point, because the CEO said it. And so I'm going to be like that person who does everything that I'm told. And it's like that's not what you're being paid to be a leader for, though. If we break this down, your company doesn't have you in that leadership role because you just do everything they say. I mean, most companies don't. Like they hired you because you have a brain on your head and they want you to make change and they want you to take your power and your agency and do something with it, not just be a sheep and follow people.
Right. That's right. Exactly. That's right. Okay. Jessica, what is the best way for us to find you, connect with you? What resources do you have? Tell us about your company and your business.
Yeah, so my company's name is Curatement, and I have a website, so it's www.curatement.com. So it's the word curate and then mint, like MINT. And my company is focused on, like I said before, creating more attainable and tactical education for leaders to develop. It's centered around emotional intelligence. So I have a four-part framework that I use that I created, again, based on my like studying my own success, but also all the leaders that I've helped grow their careers through corporate. And really it's built in a way that integrates emotional intelligence or infuses it. So you're not thinking about it like this outside thing, like I have to focus on EQ or make sure I'm using EQ. It's built into it already. So that's the way I've built it on purpose so that it is integrated. It's just the way you do things instead of again this outside piece. And then, so on LinkedIn, as you mentioned before, that's where I have tons of resources, infographics. I like to break down all the concepts related to being a corporate leader in framing it in emotionally intelligent and a balanced way. So the whole thing is you can't so I'm trying to prevent people from burning out. That's the big thing too, because we have this obviously this huge burnout epidemic. And I think part of that is we don't give people the resources to balance all the balls, right? They don't know how to keep all the balls in the air. So that's another piece that my framework is trying to solve is to infuse emotional intelligence, but also give you a way to be a balanced leader so you can actually enjoy your life, be successful, be fulfilled, and be a good just kind leader because that's what we need more of in this world. So that's what all the infographics break down, and that's on LinkedIn. I do post typically 3 to 5 days a week, kind of taking a little summer break now to kind of re-strategize. So I'll be back in a couple weeks.
On LinkedIn, we can find you under your personal name or business name.
Yes, thank you for asking. So it's under Jessica Luna. I do have a curatement page, but all of the infographics are on under my name, Jessica Luna.
Okay.
So I think my URL is Jessica Luna Leadership on LinkedIn. So if you look up Jessica Luna, I think I'll come up on even on Google for LinkedIn.
Okay. Excellent. Jessica,
Yeah.
thanks a million. Any final comment or encouragement that did not come out through any of the questions that we discussed?
I would say to be easy on yourself because we are so hard on ourselves about everything and we get frustrated when we're trying to work on stuff. So if you find yourself getting frustrated or down on yourself, just take a break, give yourself grace so that you can keep going because the work is very important and it's so worth it. So just start somewhere, give yourself grace and do it.
Love it. Thank you, Jessica. This was amazing. I totally appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was great talking with you.